In a quiet American town, Jack Harper, a war veteran haunted by his past, discovers a wounded fox kit during a storm and names her Ember. Jack's decision to care for Ember sparks fear and division in the community, particularly with Hank Thompson, a farmer who views the fox as a threat. As tensions escalate, Jack faces threats, accusations, and a critical confrontation at a town meeting. Through persistence, evidence, and heartfelt appeals, Jack proves Ember's innocence, highlighting the role of coyotes as the real culprits behind livestock attacks. A pivotal event involving the coyotes shifts the town's perspective, fostering understanding and coexistence. Ultimately, Jack makes the painful decision to release Ember into a wildlife reserve, symbolizing his growth and the community's transformation. This heartwarming tale of trust, healing, and unity underscores the power of compassion in bridging divides between humans and nature. What did you think about Jack and Ember's journey? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Share with us your perspectives on this inspiring story. Don't forget to subscribe to DG's Story for more captivating tales that touch your heart and spark meaningful conversations. Hit the bell icon to stay updated. Jack Harper tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his old Ford pickup as rain hammered against the windshield. The storm roared like an angry beast, making it nearly impossible to see the narrow forest road ahead. The windshield wipers swiped furiously, but they could barely keep up with the relentless downpour. The headlights of his truck illuminated twisted branches, slick asphalt, and occasional glimpses of pine trees that lined the deserted road. Jack had made this drive dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The storm wasn't just outside, it was inside him too. His chest tightened as memories clawed their way to the surface. Dusty streets in Afghanistan, the echo of distant gunfire, and the weight of letters he had written to grieving families. Jack blinked hard, trying to focus on the road, but the familiar ache in his heart refused to let go. Suddenly, a small shape darted across his headlights. Jack hit the brakes, his truck skidding slightly on the wet pavement before coming to a stop. Squinting through the rain, he saw something huddled on the side of the road, half submerged in the muddy ditch. "What the hell is that?" Jack muttered, turning on the hazard lights. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the truck. Instantly soaked to the bone, the cold rain bit through his flannel shirt and jeans as he trudged toward the ditch. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly in his hand, illuminating a small, shivering creature covered in mud and leaves. At first glance, it looked like a puppy, its fur matted, his body trembling. Jack's heart clenched at the sight. "Hey, little one," he said softly, crouching down. "What are you doing out here in this mess?" The creature flinched but didn't try to run. It was too weak, its rapid, shallow breaths barely audible over the storm. Without thinking twice, Jack shrugged off his jacket and gently wrapped it around the trembling animal. "You're coming with me," he murmured, lifting it into his arms. Back in the truck, Jack cranked the heater and placed the bundle on the passenger seat. The creature's eyes, wide and fearful, met his for a brief moment before closing. "It's okay," Jack said, as much to himself as to his passenger. "You're safe now." By the time Jack reached his cabin on the outskirts of the town, the storm had lessened to a steady drizzle. The warm glow of the porch light welcomed him as he carried the bundle inside. He set the creature down gently on an old towel spread across his kitchen table. Grabbing another towel, he dampened it with warm water and began wiping away the layers of mud and grime. As the dirt disappeared, Jack's brow furrowed. The creature's pointed snout, triangular ears, and slender frame became more apparent. "Well, I'll be damned," Jack muttered, stepping back. "You're not a puppy at all, are you?" The creature opened its eyes, revealing a pair of amber orbs that seemed to glow in the dim kitchen light. It was a fox, a small, fragile kit, barely clinging to life. For a moment, Jack considered calling animal control. They'd know what to do. But as he looked at the tiny, helpless creature, something inside him shifted. He couldn't just hand it over to strangers. Not after seeing the fear and exhaustion in its eyes. "You need a name," Jack said, his voice softer now. He thought for a moment, glancing at the flickering fire in the hearth. "Ember. Yeah, that fits." Jack worked quickly, setting up a makeshift bed in a small wooden crate lined with an old blanket. Ember curled into a tight ball, her breathing shallow but steady, as Jack sat in his worn armchair. Sipping a cup of chamomile tea, he found himself staring at the tiny creature. She was so vulnerable, so dependent. In that moment, Jack realized he wasn't just saving Ember. She was saving him too. The morning after the storm, Jack awoke to a faint rustling sound. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. But as his senses sharpened, he realized it was coming from the kitchen. Throwing off the blanket, he hurried to investigate. There, on the counter, was Ember, her tiny paws resting on a jar of peanut butter, her nose twitching furiously as she tried to figure out how to open it. "How did you even get up there?" Jack asked, half amused, half exasperated. Ember froze, her amber eyes locking with his, before attempting to scramble off the counter. Jack lunged forward just in time, catching her mid-air. "You're a troublemaker, aren't you?" he said, cradling the squirming fox. She responded with a soft yip, a sound somewhere between a bark and a chirp, as if protesting his interference. Despite the chaos, Jack couldn't help but chuckle. It was clear that raising a fox was going to be very different from anything he'd experienced before. Later that day, Jack drove into town to gather supplies. As he walked into the general store, the bell above the door jingled, drawing the attention of a few regulars. Among them was Hank Thompson, leaning against the counter and chatting with the clerk. "Well, if it isn't Jack Harper," Hank drawled, his tone always carrying a hint of condescension. "Haven't seen you around much. What brings you out of the woods?" "Just picking up a few things," Jack replied curtly, grabbing a basket. As Jack moved through the aisles, Hank followed, his curiosity clearly piqued. "You've been keeping to yourself even more than usual. Something going on?" Jack ignored him and focused on his list: dog food, cleaning supplies, a sturdy latch for the crate he'd hastily thrown together. But Hank wasn't easily deterred. "Word is you've got yourself a pet," Hank said, leaning against the shelf. "That true?" Jack paused, debating how much to share. "Found a little fox kit in the storm," he said finally, keeping his tone neutral. Hank's eyebrows shot up. "A fox? Jack, those things are wild. They don't belong in a house, let alone this town. I'm taking care of her until she's better," Jack said, his patience wearing thin. "That's all." "Well, just be careful," Hank said, his tone shifting to something darker. "Foxes might seem harmless, but they're trouble. You let your guard down, and they'll bite." Jack paid for his items and left without another word, the weight of Hank's warning lingering in his mind. Back at the cabin, Jack focused on making Ember's space more secure. He reinforced the crate with stronger wood and added a latch to prevent any more escapes. Ember watched him curiously from her spot on the floor, occasionally tilting her head or twitching her ears as if trying to understand what he was doing. As days turned into weeks, Jack began to notice subtle changes. Ember grew more comfortable around him, her initial fear replaced by cautious curiosity. She followed him around the cabin, her tiny paws making almost no sound on the wooden floor. One evening, as Jack sat by the fire, Ember tentatively approached him. She placed one paw on his knee, her eyes meeting his. Jack stayed still, allowing her to take the lead. Slowly, she climbed onto his lap, curling up in a tight ball. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Ember wasn't just a wild animal anymore. She was a companion, a fragile thread connecting him to something bigger than himself. As Ember grew stronger, her playful antics became more frequent. Jack couldn't help but smile at her boundless energy, but he knew it wouldn't be long before others in the small town began to notice her presence. The first sign of trouble came on a crisp Saturday morning. Jack was chopping firewood in the backyard when he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Looking up, he saw Hank Thompson standing by the fence, arms crossed over his chest. "Morning, Jack," Hank called, his tone carrying an edge of accusation. "Morning," Jack replied, setting down the axe and wiping his hands on his jeans. Hank gestured toward the makeshift enclosure Jack had built for Ember. "That for a dog?" Jack hesitated for a moment before answering. "It's for the fox I told you about, Ember." Hank's expression darkened. "You're really keeping that thing around?" "Jack, you know as well as I do, foxes don't belong in people's backyards. They're predators. Dangerous." "She's not dangerous," Jack said firmly. "She's just a kit. She wouldn't survive on her own right now." Hank shook his head. "You're playing with fire. What happens when she gets older? Stronger? You think she'll just sit around waiting for scraps? She'll follow her instincts, Jack. And when she does, someone's livestock is gonna pay for it." Jack's jaw tightened. "I'm taking care of her, Hank. She's not a threat to anyone." "Well, the rest of the town might not see it that way," Hank warned, his tone dropping. "Just don't say I didn't tell you so." The tension between Jack and Hank simmered for days. But things came to a head when one of Hank's goats was found dead near the edge of his property. The rumors started almost immediately, spreading through the town like wildfire. "I heard Harper's fox got loose," one man said to another at the diner. "Damn shame, keeping something like that so close to people." Another replied. Jack, unaware of the spreading gossip, walked into the diner one afternoon to grab a coffee. The room went quiet as he stepped inside. "You hear what happened at Thompson's place?" The waitress, Betty, asked cautiously as she handed him his coffee. "No, what?" Jack asked, already sensing the answer. "Hank lost a goat, people are saying." Betty trailed off, glancing around the room. "They're saying it was Ember," Jack finished, his tone low. Betty nodded. "Hank's real upset, Jack. He's been telling folks your fox is dangerous." Jack clenched his jaw, fighting the urge to lash out. He left the diner without finishing his coffee, his mind racing. He knew Ember hadn't left the enclosure. He'd made sure of it. But proving her innocence would be another matter entirely. That evening, Jack drove to Dr. Lucy Carter's clinic on the outskirts of town. Lucy greeted him at the door, her expression immediately shifting to concern when she saw the tension in his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, ushering him inside. "People are saying Ember killed one of Hank's goats," Jack said, running a hand through his hair. "But it's not true. She hasn't been out of the enclosure." Lucy frowned. "Foxes aren't the only predators around here. Coyotes, stray dogs, even wolves could have done it. But you're right, this could get ugly if people believe Ember's responsible." "Can you help me prove it wasn't her?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with desperation. Lucy nodded. "We'll start by checking for tracks or any other signs near Hank's property. If it wasn't Ember, we need to figure out what it was before this spirals out of control." Jack felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since the accusations began, he wasn't facing the storm alone. Early the next morning, Jack and Lucy arrived at Hank Thompson's property. The air was crisp, and the first rays of sunlight cut through the fog that clung to the fields. Hank was waiting near the edge of the pasture, his arms crossed and his face etched with irritation. "This had better be quick," Hank grumbled. "I don't need anyone telling me what I already know. Your fox is trouble, Jack. We're here to figure out the truth," Lucy said calmly, her veterinarian bag slung over her shoulder. "If there's evidence pointing to another predator, you'll want to know that too." Hank huffed but stepped aside as Lucy crouched near the remains of the goat. Jack stayed silent, his fists clenched at his sides as he watched Lucy work. She inspected the carcass carefully, her gloved hands moving with precision. "These bite marks aren't from a fox," Lucy said after a moment, pointing to a deep wound on the goat's neck. "Foxes have smaller jaws. This looks like the work of a coyote or possibly a wolf. Hank scowled. How do you know for sure? Lucy stood, brushing her hands on her jeans. We'll need to confirm it, but I've seen this kind of damage before. Foxes usually scavenge. They don't attack animals this size unless they're desperate. Jack stepped forward. You see, Ember didn't do this. Hank muttered something under his breath, but before he could respond, Lucy gestured toward the soft earth near the pasture fence. Look here, she said, crouching again. Jack and Hank leaned in to see a set of tracks pressed into the mud. The paw prints were much larger than Ember's, with clear claw marks visible. That's not a fox, Lucy confirmed. These tracks are from a coyote or a pack of them. Despite the evidence, the rumors about Ember continued to spread. At the general store, in the diner, and even at the church on Sunday, Jack's name was whispered alongside words like reckless and dangerous. I heard he's keeping that fox in his house, one woman said, shaking her head. It's only a matter of time before it goes after a child. Another added, Jack avoided town as much as he could, but the weight of the community's judgment was impossible to escape. Even his closest neighbors started acting differently. Mrs. Cartwright, who used to wave cheerfully from her porch, now avoided eye contact. One afternoon, as Jack returned from chopping wood, he found a note nailed to his fence. The words were scrawled in thick, angry letters. Get rid of the fox before we do. Jack's hands trembled as he pulled the note down. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Lucy came by the cabin that evening, bringing a bag of supplies for Ember. She found Jack sitting on the porch steps, the crumpled note in his hand. Someone left this, he said, handing it to her without a word. Lucy's face darkened as she read the note. This is getting out of hand, she said. We need to act fast, Jack. If the town doesn't feel safe, they won't stop until Ember is gone. What do we do? Jack asked, his voice low. Lucy hesitated. We need more evidence. Something definitive that clears Ember's name. If we can set up a camera near Hank's property and catch whatever's out there, it might be enough to convince people to back off. Jack nodded, determination hardening in his chest. Let's do it. That night, Jack and Lucy borrowed a trail camera from Ben Miller, the local handyman who lived deeper in the woods. Ben was skeptical at first, but after hearing Jack's story, he agreed to help. Coyotes are smart, Ben said as he adjusted the camera, but they're creatures of habit. If they've been here once, they'll come back. They set up the camera near the pasture, placing bait to ensure the predators returned. Jack stayed awake long into the night, staring out the window and listening to Ember's soft breaths as she slept in her crate. For the first time since he found her, he felt the fragile thread connecting them being stretched to its limit. If the town turned against him completely, he wasn't sure how long he could hold on. The following morning, Jack, Lucy, and Ben returned to the trail camera they had set up near Hank's pasture. The early sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the damp earth. Ben crouched by the camera, carefully removing the memory card and inserting it into a small portable reader. Let's see what we've got, Ben muttered as he scrolled through the footage. The first few frames showed nothing unusual, just the empty pasture swaying gently in the night breeze. But then, around midnight, a shadowy figure appeared on the screen. There, Lucy said, leaning closer. The video showed a coyote creeping along the edge of the pasture, its lean body moving with predatory intent. A second coyote joined moments later, their eyes glinting in the infrared light of the camera. Two of them, Ben confirmed, pointing to the screen. That explains why Hank's goat didn't stand a chance. As they continued watching, the footage clearly showed the coyotes stalking and eventually attacking the goat. Their sharp teeth and coordinated movements left no room for doubt. Jack exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. This is it. This proves Ember didn't do it. Lucy nodded, her expression serious. We need to show this to the town as soon as possible. The longer the rumors spread, the harder it'll be to change their minds. That evening, Jack drove into town with Lucy to meet Hank at the general store. They found him outside, talking with a group of locals. As Jack approached, the conversation died down, replaced by suspicious glances and murmured whispers. "What do you want?" "Harper," Hank said, his tone laced with irritation. "I've got proof Ember didn't kill your goat." Jack replied, holding up the memory card. "Coyotes did it. We caught them on camera." Hank folded his arms, unimpressed. "You expect me to take your word for it?" "No," Lucy said firmly, stepping forward. "That's why we're asking everyone to watch the footage at the town meeting tomorrow night. It's time people see the truth." Hank hesitated, glancing at the group of locals who were watching closely. He could feel the pressure to respond, to maintain his position as one of the town's most influential voices. "Fine," he said at last, his voice begrudging. "But if this is some kind of trick, Harper, it won't end well for you." As Jack and Lucy left the general store, the tension in the air was palpable. They could hear fragments of conversations from the crowd, some skeptical, others hostile. "You think they'll listen?" Jack asked as they climbed into his truck. "They have to," Lucy replied, though her voice carried an edge of uncertainty. That night, Jack double-checked the enclosure to make sure Ember was secure. She watched him from inside, her amber eyes glowing softly in the dim light. "You're safe," Jack whispered, stroking the soft fur on her head. "We'll get through this." But as he sat by the window, watching the shadows shift outside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the town's anger was growing, and that it might soon boil over into something he couldn't control. The next evening, the town hall was packed. Rows of folding chairs were filled with farmers, shopkeepers, and families, all buzzing with anticipation. Whispers rippled through the crowd, some curious, others openly hostile. Jack stood at the back of the room with Lucy and Ben. In his hand was the trail camera footage, loaded onto a USB drive. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the sea of faces, many of which were familiar but distant. At the front of the room, Mayor Sharon Caldwell banged her gavel. "Order, please," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "We're here tonight to discuss the recent concerns regarding livestock safety and Jack Harper's fox." The mention of Ember caused a wave of murmurs to sweep the room. Jack clenched his jaw but stayed silent. Hank Thompson rose from his seat, his imposing figure drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "Let me make this simple," he said, his voice booming. "That fox doesn't belong in this town. It's a wild animal, and it's putting us all at risk. Harper's being reckless, and now one of my goats is dead because of it." Scattered murmurs of agreement echoed through the hall. Jack felt a surge of anger but forced himself to remain calm. Lucy stepped forward, her head held high. "We have evidence that proves Ember isn't responsible," she said, her voice steady. "The real culprits are coyotes. We caught them on camera near Hank's pasture." She handed the USB drive to Mayor Caldwell, who inserted it into the laptop connected to the projector. The screen flickered to life, and the room fell silent as the footage played. The video showed the coyotes slinking through the shadows, their predatory movements unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the footage showed them attacking the goat. The size and aggression of the animals left no doubt. They were far larger and more dangerous than Ember. "This is clear proof," Lucy said, stepping back to address the room. "Ember was in her enclosure the entire time. She's not a threat to anyone." Hank scowled, his face flushing with frustration. "That doesn't mean the fox isn't dangerous," he snapped. "Coyotes or not, wild animals don't belong in backyards. It's only a matter of time before something worse happens." Before Jack could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Are we really going to let fear dictate how we treat someone who's just trying to help?" The crowd turned to see Mrs. Grace Cartwright, one of the oldest residents of the town, standing with the help of her cane. Her voice was steady despite her frail appearance. "When I was a girl, foxes roamed these woods all the time," she said. "We never thought of them as enemies. They're part of the land, just like us. Maybe it's time we remember that." Mrs. Cartwright's words caused a stir. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained unconvinced. Hank, however, wasn't ready to back down. "This isn't about history," he growled. "This is about keeping our families safe. If Harper wants to live with a fox, that's his choice. But when that choice puts the rest of us at risk, it's a problem." Jack finally stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "I understand your concerns, Hank," he said, meeting the man's glare. "But Ember isn't the threat here. She's just a kit, a small, scared animal trying to survive. Blaming her for what the coyotes did isn't going to solve anything." He paused, looking around the room. "I've seen real danger before, overseas, in places where survival wasn't guaranteed. I came back here to find peace, and for the first time in years, Ember has given me a reason to feel like I belong again. She's not just a fox. She's a second chance for both of us." The room fell silent. Jack's words hung heavy in the air, their sincerity cutting through the tension like a blade. As Jack's words faded, the room sat in silence, some visibly moved, others skeptical. Hank, however, remained defiant. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Nice speech, Harper," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But words don't change the facts. That fox doesn't belong here." Before anyone could respond, Hank pulled out his phone. "If you don't believe me, maybe this will change your mind." He turned the screen toward the crowd, playing a grainy video. It showed a fox prowling near a chicken coop, its movements erratic and aggressive. The audience gasped, and whispers spread like wildfire. "That's not Ember," Lucy interjected, stepping forward. "The size, the markings, this isn't even the same fox." "How do we know that?" Hank shot back. "It's a fox, isn't it? How many foxes do you think live around here?" Jack's fists clenched. "You're grasping at straws, Hank," he said, his voice low but firm. "That video doesn't prove anything about Ember. It proves we can't trust wild animals." Hank snapped. "And it proves we can't trust you to keep this town safe." The video reignited the crowd. Fear and doubt rippled through the room as more people began voicing their concerns. "He's got a point," someone muttered. "We can't risk it." Another agreed, but others pushed back. "What about the evidence from the camera?" Mrs. Cartwright said, her voice cutting through the noise. "It clearly shows coyotes were responsible, not Ember." "It doesn't matter," a man from the back called out. "Foxes are dangerous, no matter what." The room devolved into chaos as the two sides argued, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and reason. Jack stepped forward, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "Enough," he said, his voice commanding. The room gradually fell silent. "I'm not asking you to like what I'm doing," he began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But I am asking you to think. Ember is an innocent animal. She didn't ask to be caught in the middle of this, and she doesn't deserve to be punished for something she didn't do." He gestured toward Lucy. "We have real evidence that proves she's not a threat. But if you let fear cloud your judgment, you'll never see the truth." Jack's words caused some in the audience to pause, their expressions softening, but Hank remained unmoved. Hank took a step forward, his jaw set. "If you're so sure about this fox, then let's settle it. Prove to us that she's safe, or give her up to animal control." A murmur spread through the crowd, and Jack's chest tightened. He looked at Lucy, who shook her head subtly, signaling her disapproval of Hank's ultimatum. Jack turned back to the crowd. "I won't hand Ember over to anyone," he said firmly. "She's not just some wild animal to be thrown away. She's part of my family now." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Then don't blame us when something else happens," he said darkly. That night, the tension in the small town reached a breaking point. While Jack tried to calm his thoughts at home, Hank gathered a group of like-minded residents at the local bar. Fueled by fear and frustration, they began whispering about taking matters into their own hands. "We've given Harper enough chances," Hank said, slamming his fist on the table. "If he won't get rid of that fox, we will." A murmur of agreement spread through the group. Plans were hastily formed. And by the time the bar closed, Hank and a few others were ready to act. Around midnight, Jack was jolted awake by the sound of barking dogs and a loud bang. His heart raced as he grabbed a flashlight and rushed outside. Near Ember's enclosure, the scene was chaotic. A group of men, their faces obscured by hats and scarves, were trying to open the gate. One of them held a long pole with a noose at the end, clearly intended to capture Ember. "Get away from her," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. The men froze, their surprise quickly replaced by defiance. Hank stepped forward, his face shadowed but unmistakable. "This isn't your decision anymore, Harper," he said. "That fox is a danger to everyone." "She hasn't hurt anyone," Jack yelled, moving to stand between the men and Ember's enclosure. Ember, now fully awake, cowered in the corner, her eyes wide with terror. "This isn't right," Jack continued, his voice trembling with emotion. "You're not protecting anyone. You're just giving in to fear." Hank hesitated, but one of the other men pushed forward. "Get out of the way, Jack. You don't want this to get ugly." The confrontation escalated as Jack refused to move. The flashlight in his hand shook slightly, but his resolve didn't waver. "This is my property," he said firmly, "and Ember is under my care. If any of you lay a hand on her, I'll call the sheriff." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Most of them hadn't expected Jack to stand his ground so fiercely. Hank, however, was undeterred. "Call the sheriff if you want," Hank sneered. "But by the time they get here, it'll be too late." Before anyone could react, the sound of approaching tires broke the tension. Headlights swept across the yard, and moments later, Lucy and Ben emerged from Ben's truck. "What the hell is going on here?" Lucy demanded, her voice sharp. Ben stepped forward, his imposing figure making the group hesitate. "This isn't how we do things," he said coldly. "If you've got a problem, you take it up with the mayor. Not like this." Realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, the group began to disperse. Hank lingered for a moment, his eyes locked on Jack's. "This isn't over," he said quietly before turning to leave. As the last of the men disappeared into the night, Jack let out a shaky breath. Lucy placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" Jack nodded, though his hands still trembled. "I knew things were bad, but I didn't think they'd go this far." "They're scared," Ben said, glancing toward the woods. "But fear doesn't justify what they just tried to do." Inside the enclosure, Ember finally relaxed. Curling up in a corner as the tension dissipated, Jack crouched beside her, stroking her fur gently. "I won't let them hurt you," he whispered. "Not ever." That night, as Jack sat by the fire, he realized the situation had reached a critical point. The town wasn't just divided, they were at war with themselves. If he couldn't find a way to bridge the gap, both he and Ember would be in danger. But Jack wasn't ready to give up. With Lucy and Ben by his side, he began planning his next move, a way to turn fear into understanding and conflict into compassion. The morning after the attack, Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring at a blank piece of paper. The events of the previous night still weighed heavily on him, but he knew he couldn't afford to dwell on his anger. If he didn't take action, the fear and division in the town would only grow. Lucy arrived shortly after sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee and a stack of papers. "I've been thinking," she began, setting everything down on the table. "Last night was a breaking point. If we don't change the way people see Ember, and foxes in general, this won't end." Jack nodded, grateful for her unwavering support. "But how?" "Hank and his group won't listen to reason, no matter what we say." Lucy tapped the stack of papers. "We don't just need words, we need action. A community event, something that educates people about wildlife and shows them the truth about Ember. If we can get enough people to see her as more than just a wild animal, we might have a chance." "A community event?" Jack raised an eyebrow. "You really think people will show up after everything that's happened?" "They will if we frame it right," Lucy said confidently. We'll make it about more than just Ember. We'll focus on conservation, the role of predators in the ecosystem, and how to live alongside wildlife. It's about the bigger picture. Jack considered this for a moment before nodding. All right, let's do it. Lucy and Jack spent the next few hours calling on allies in the town. Ben was the first to join, offering to help with logistics and build displays for the event. I'll talk to the mayor, Ben said, flipping through his notebook. If she approves it, we can use the community center and the surrounding park. Mrs. Grace Cartwright, inspired by Jack's speech at the town meeting, volunteered to help spread the word among the older residents. People will listen to me, she said with a sly smile. I have a way of making them feel guilty when they don't. Even a few unexpected supporters came forward, including Sarah from the bakery, who offered to donate snacks, and Pastor Miller, who suggested tying the event to themes of stewardship and compassion. But not everyone was on board. When Jack tried to approach Hank, he was met with a slammed door and a harsh, "Leave me alone." It's all right, Lucy said when Jack returned, looking defeated. We don't need everyone to agree. We just need enough people to start changing the conversation. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Ben constructed a large enclosure where Ember could safely interact with visitors under supervision. Lucy created educational pamphlets about foxes and their role in the ecosystem, while Mrs. Cartwright gathered stories from older residents who remembered coexisting peacefully with wildlife. Jack focused on preparing Ember. He spent hours with her each day, helping her grow more accustomed to people. First, Ember was skittish, but with time and patience, she began to relax in Jack's presence and even allowed Lucy to feed her. You're doing great, Jack whispered one evening as Ember nuzzled his hand. We're going to show them who you really are. The event was set for the following Saturday, and as the date approached, the town buzzed with curiosity and apprehension. Whispers of doubt mingled with cautious optimism, but Jack held on to hope. Saturday dawned bright and clear, the autumn air crisp with a gentle breeze. Jack stood in the park, looking over the setup with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. Ben and a few volunteers were putting the finishing touches on the informational booths, while Lucy double-checked the enclosure to ensure it was secure. The space was lively and inviting. Posters about local wildlife lined the pathways, each featuring vibrant photos and simple explanations about the importance of animals like foxes, coyotes, and birds of prey. Tables were stocked with pamphlets, and Ben had even set up a display of plaster-cast animal tracks for children to explore. In the center of it all was Ember's enclosure, shaded by a large oak tree. Inside, she rested quietly, her bright amber eyes alert but calm. Jack had placed her favorite blanket in the corner, hoping it would make her feel more secure. Looks good, Lucy said, walking over. Now we just have to see who shows up. Jack nodded, scanning the park entrance. Let's hope it's more than just the people who already agree with us. The first hour passed with only a trickle of visitors. Families with young children wandered through the booths, pausing to look at the displays or listen to Lucy talk about foxes' roles in controlling rodent populations. Jack stayed close to Ember's enclosure, quietly answering questions from those curious enough to approach. One young boy pressed his hands against the glass, his eyes wide with wonder as Ember lifted her head to sniff the air. She's beautiful, the boy said, looking up at Jack. She is, Jack agreed, smiling. And she's not as scary as some people think. But as the morning wore on, a different group began to arrive. Hank and a handful of his supporters stood at the edge of the park, their arms crossed and their expressions skeptical. Jack's stomach tightened as he watched them mutter among themselves. Let them look, Lucy said quietly, noticing Jack's unease. The more they see, the harder it'll be for them to hold on to their fears. As the crowd grew, so did the questions. Mrs. Cartwright captivated a small group with her stories about growing up alongside foxes, while Pastor Miller spoke to another group about the importance of respecting all creatures. At Ember's enclosure, Jack found himself face to face with Hank. The man's expression was guarded, but his tone was less combative than usual. "So, this is her," Hank said, nodding toward Ember. "She's harmless," Jack said, his voice steady, "and she's only here because she wouldn't have survived on her own." Hank studied Ember for a long moment. She shifted slightly under his gaze but remained calm, her trust in Jack evident. "She doesn't look like much of a threat," Hank admitted grudgingly. "But that doesn't mean she belongs here." "She belongs somewhere safe," Jack countered. "And right now, that's with me." Hank didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped back, his expression unreadable as he rejoined his group. As the event continued, more residents arrived, including families, teachers, and even some hesitant farmers. The mood of the park began to shift from skepticism to cautious engagement. Ember's calm demeanor and the informative displays seemed to resonate with many, but not everyone was convinced. Near the early afternoon, Hank stepped forward, drawing the attention of the crowd. His voice carried over the chatter, silencing conversations as he addressed Jack directly. "All right, Harper," Hank began, his tone sharp but measured. "You've got everyone here watching your fox, reading your pamphlets, but I've got a question for you. What happens when she's not in that cage? What happens when her instincts kick in?" A murmur spread through the crowd, and Jack felt dozens of eyes shift toward him. "She's not like the wild foxes you're used to," Jack replied, keeping his voice steady. "She's been with me since she was a kid. She trusts me, and I've taken every step to ensure she's safe. Not just for her, but for everyone around her." "That's not an answer," Hank shot back. "You're asking this town to take a risk because you think you've tamed a wild animal. But what if you're wrong?" Jack stepped closer to the center of the crowd, feeling the weight of their attention. He took a deep breath, his mind racing to find the right words. "I understand why you're scared," he began, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. "I've been scared too. I've faced things overseas that most people never have to see. Things that made me question everything I believed about trust and safety. But Ember isn't one of those things. She's not a threat. She's a reminder." Jack paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "She's a reminder that fear doesn't have to control us. We can choose to understand, to learn, and to coexist. I'm not asking you to take a risk for no reason. I'm asking you to see her for what she really is, a second chance." The crowd was silent, many clearly moved by his words, but Hank, still unconvinced, crossed his arms. "Words are nice, Harper, but they don't prove anything." Jack glanced at Ember's enclosure. She was sitting calmly, her head tilted slightly as if she could feel the tension in the air. Jack turned back to the crowd. "If words aren't enough," he said, his voice firm, "then let me show you." To the crowd's surprise, Jack opened the gate of Ember's enclosure. Gasps rippled through the audience as Ember hesitated, her amber eyes darting between Jack and the open space. "She trusts me," Jack said, kneeling to her level. "And I trust her." He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Ember stepped out of the enclosure and onto the grass. The crowd tensed, many holding their breath. But Jack remained calm. Ember trotted to Jack's side and nuzzled his hand. Her movements relaxed and unthreatening. Jack looked up at the crowd. "This is who she is," he said. "Not a predator, not a danger, just an animal trying to live." The crowd's response to Jack's gesture was a mix of awe and apprehension. Children whispered excitedly to their parents, while others shifted uneasily, clearly unsure about the decision to let Ember out. One man near the front, an older farmer named Bill, broke the silence. "She doesn't seem dangerous," he admitted, scratching his head. "But how can you guarantee she won't turn wild later?" Jack stood, Ember remaining calmly at his side. "Because trust works both ways," he said. "I've spent months building that trust with her. She knows I'm not a threat, just like I know she's not one. That kind of bond doesn't break easily." Mrs. Cartwright, standing in the middle of the crowd, nodded in agreement. "He's right. Animals respond to kindness. You treat them with respect, and they'll give it back. But not everyone was convinced. Hank stepped forward, his jaw tight with frustration. You all keep talking about trust and kindness, but what about instincts? What happens when that fox gets hungry or scared? What happens when it decides it doesn't want to trust anymore? Jack clenched his fists, but before he could respond, Lucy stepped in. That's why we're here, Hank, she said firmly, to educate people about wildlife and how to coexist with it safely. Foxes don't need to be feared, they need to be understood, and Ember is the perfect example of that. Hank wasn't swayed. This is all well and good until something goes wrong, he said, pointing at Ember. And when it does, it's not just on you, Harper, it's on all of us. The tension in the air was thick as the crowd murmured uneasily. Jack knew this was his last chance to make them see the truth. I can't promise nothing will ever go wrong, he admitted, his voice steady. No one can. But what I can promise is that Ember isn't the villain you've made her out to be. She's not the one attacking livestock or causing chaos. She's just trying to live, just like we all are. He knelt beside Ember again, gently stroking her fur. If we can't find a way to live alongside creatures like her, then what does that say about us? About our ability to protect what matters, not just for us, but for future generations. Before the conversation could continue, a sudden noise broke through the tension. From the edge of the park, the distant sound of howling carried through the air. Heads turned toward the treeline, and several people gasped as a pair of coyotes emerged, their lean bodies moving cautiously toward the open space. They're back, someone shouted. The crowd began to scatter, panic rippling through the gathering. Hank's hand moved instinctively to his belt, where a hunting knife was strapped. But Jack raised his hand. Wait, he called out, stepping forward. Don't scare them off. The coyotes froze, their sharp eyes darting between the people and the scent of food lingering near the booths. Jack's heart raced, but he kept his movements slow and deliberate. This is their territory too, he said, his voice calm but firm. They're not here to hurt anyone. They're just looking for food. Jack reached into a nearby bag of supplies and pulled out a piece of dried meat. He tossed it several feet in front of the coyotes, far enough to keep them from coming closer to the crowd. The animals hesitated, then cautiously approached, grabbing the food before retreating into the woods. The crowd watched in stunned silence. Even Hank seemed momentarily at a loss for words. That's what it looks like to coexist, Lucy said, breaking the silence. Understanding their behavior, respecting their space, and finding ways to live alongside them. Jack turned back to the crowd. It's not about eliminating fear, it's about managing it. If we can do that, we'll all be better off. As the coyotes disappeared into the trees, a hush fell over the park. The once tense atmosphere had softened, replaced by a mix of awe and reflection. For the first time, the townsfolk seemed to grasp what Jack and Lucy had been trying to convey. That coexistence with wildlife wasn't about domination or fear, but understanding and balance. A voice broke the silence. I never thought I'd see that, Bill said, his tone thoughtful. I've been on this land my whole life, and I always saw them as pests. But maybe we've been looking at it wrong. Other murmurs of agreement followed, and Jack felt a glimmer of hope. But there was one person whose reaction mattered most. Hank remained quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. The crowd turned to him, waiting for his response. Jack stepped closer, his voice steady but devoid of animosity. Hank, he said, I know this isn't easy for you. You've seen your livelihood threatened, and I get that. But this isn't about taking sides. It's about finding a way forward together. For a moment, it seemed like Hank might lash out again. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. But then, his gaze shifted to Ember, who was sitting calmly by Jack's feet. Her demeanor was far from threatening. She was just a small, curious creature trying to find her place in the world. Hank let out a heavy sigh, the fight draining from his posture. I still don't like it, he admitted gruffly. But maybe you're right. Maybe this isn't about the fox at all. It's about us, how we handle things." The crowd murmured in approval, and Jack felt a weight lift from his chest. The rest of the event continued without incident. People who had been skeptical earlier in the day lingered by the booths, asking questions and taking pamphlets. Mrs. Cartwright shared more stories, while Pastor Miller spoke about stewardship and compassion. By the end of the afternoon, even Hank stopped by Ember's enclosure, watching her with a wary but curious gaze. "Still think she's trouble?" Lucy asked lightly as she approached him. Hank shook his head. "Maybe not," he said grudgingly, "but don't expect me to be her biggest fan." Lucy smiled. "Fair enough. One step at a time." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack sat by Ember's enclosure, watching her curl up on her blanket. The park was quiet now, the crowd long gone, but the sense of progress lingered in the air. Lucy joined him, a satisfied smile on her face. "You did it, Jack. You changed their minds." "We did it," Jack corrected, looking at her with gratitude. Ember let out a soft yip, as if chiming in her agreement. Jack chuckled, reaching through the bars to stroke her fur. "And you," he said to her, "you proved them all wrong." In the weeks that followed, the town began to change. Fences were reinforced to protect livestock, but without the hostility toward wildlife. Signs were put up near the woods, reminding people to respect the animals' habitats. Even Hank, though still gruff, started to come around. One afternoon, Jack spotted him in town, talking to Lucy about a new kind of predator-proof chicken coop. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For Jack, life with Ember settled into a peaceful routine. She remained a constant companion, a reminder of the lessons they had taught the town and each other. And in a small way, Jack realized that Ember had saved him as much as he had saved her. The days after the event felt lighter, as if a storm had finally passed. For the first time in months, Jack walked through town without feeling the weight of judgment. People greeted him with nods or small smiles, and a few even stopped to ask about Ember. At the general store, Sarah from the bakery handed him a loaf of fresh bread. "For you and Ember," she said warmly. "She's lucky to have someone like you." Jack thanked her, his chest swelling with gratitude. It was a small gesture, but it symbolized something much bigger. The town was starting to see Ember not as a threat, but as a symbol of resilience and trust. As the weeks went on, Jack couldn't ignore the reality he had been avoiding. Ember was growing. Her instincts were sharpening, and while she was still bonded to him, it was clear she needed more than what his cabin and the enclosure could provide. One crisp morning, Jack called Lucy over for a cup of coffee. As they sat on the porch, Ember lay at Jack's feet, her ears twitching as she listened to the sounds of the forest. "She's not meant to stay here forever," Jack said, his voice heavy. "She needs to be where she belongs, in the wild." Lucy nodded, her expression empathetic. "I've been thinking the same thing," she admitted. "There's a wildlife reserve a few hours from here. They have specialists who can help her transition back into the wild." The thought of letting Ember go made Jack's chest ache, but he knew it was the right decision. The day came sooner than Jack expected. He packed a small crate with Ember's blanket and a few of her favorite toys, even though he knew she wouldn't need them where she was going. Lucy drove them to the wildlife reserve, a sprawling expanse of protected land filled with meadows, forests, and streams. As they arrived, a kind-faced biologist named Dr. Reynolds greeted them. "She's a beautiful fox," Dr. Reynolds said, kneeling to get a closer look at Ember. "You've done an incredible job caring for her. She's healthy, confident. She'll do well here." Jack knelt beside Ember's crate, his hand resting on the latch. Ember tilted her head, her amber eyes meeting his as if sensing what was about to happen. "You'll be okay," Jack whispered, his throat tight. "This is where you're meant to be." With trembling hands, he opened the crate. Ember stepped out cautiously, sniffing the air. She hesitated, looking back at Jack one last time before bounding into the tall grass. Jack watched her go, his heart both breaking and swelling with pride. Back in town, the changes sparked by Ember's story continued to grow. The community embraced the idea of living in harmony with wildlife, and new programs were launched to educate children about conservation. The town even held an annual Wildlife Day in Ember's honor, featuring booths, guided nature walks, and educational talks. Jack was often invited to speak, sharing the story of how a small fox had changed not only his life but the heart of the entire community. Hank, though still rough around the edges, became an unlikely ally in the effort. He and Jack worked together on building predator-proof coops and fences, finding common ground in their shared goal of protecting both livestock and wildlife. With Ember gone, Jack found himself with more time and a renewed sense of purpose. He began volunteering at the community center, helping veterans who were struggling to adjust to civilian life. One evening, as he shared his story with a group of young veterans, he realized how much Ember had taught him about trust, healing, and letting go. "She reminded me that it's okay to start over," Jack said, his voice steady, "and that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that make us stronger." The group listened intently, their faces softening as they absorbed his words. Months later, on a quiet afternoon, Jack sat on his porch, sipping a cup of tea. The forest around him was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. In the distance, he thought he saw a flash of amber fur darting through the trees. His heart skipped a beat, but he quickly dismissed it as wishful thinking. Even so, the sight brought a smile to his face. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Ember might be gone, but her spirit remained, a constant reminder of the power of connection and the resilience of both man and nature. Jack's story and Ember's legacy became part of the town's identity. Visitors from neighboring areas came to learn about their journey, inspired by the way a single fox had brought a divided community together. And for Jack, life continued not without challenges, but with a renewed sense of hope. As he looked out at the forest, Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude for Ember, for Lucy, and for the town that had learned to see the world through a new lens. Because in the end, it wasn't just Ember who had been saved. It was all of them,